The dirt road stretched ahead like a forgotten path, flanked by empty fields silenced by the biting cold of the night. The sky was pitch black, starless, as if even the universe sensed that something terrible was about to happen. Officer Jonathan John Matthews gripped the steering wheel of his patrol vehicle, his eyes scanning the road with the trained focus of a man who had seen too much. Beside him, sitting in the passenger seat, Maximus, his loyal K9 German Shepherd, remained still yet alert, ears perked up, nose twitching as if already catching the scent of trouble. Maximus had a way of sensing danger before John could even put a name to it. The radio crackled suddenly, and the rough voice of the dispatcher filled the cabin. Unit 314, we've got a report of possible trespassing at an abandoned barn about 2 miles from your current location. Witness claims to have seen figures moving around the property. No other units available at this time. Can you respond? John grabbed the radio and pressed the button, keeping his eyes on the road. This is 314, en route. His voice was calm, but something about this call didn't sit right with him. Normally, these types of reports turned out to be nothing more than teenagers messing around or vagrants looking for shelter from the cold. But there was something in the way the dispatcher hesitated, something in their tone, that made the hair on the back of John's neck stand up. Wasting no time, he killed the headlights as he neared the location, pulling off about half a mile from the barn. He didn't want to announce his arrival. Cutting the engine, he turned to Maximus, who was already in position, eyes locked on the shadowy structure ahead. The dog sensed something. He always did. John eased the door open carefully, avoiding unnecessary noise, and Maximus leapt out with practiced precision. The freezing night air bit at John's skin, but he ignored it, advancing through the open field with careful steps, his boots pressing into the damp soil. The distant rustling of trees in the wind created an eerie atmosphere, a whisper of warnings that no one could quite understand. The barn loomed in front of him like a sleeping beast, its weathered wooden walls beaten down by time and neglect. The main door was slightly ajar, creaking softly as the cold breeze passed through. John stopped a few yards away and pulled out his flashlight, sweeping a beam of light inside. The dirt floor was covered in fresh tracks. Someone had been here, or was still inside. Maximus moved first, sniffing the air with quick precision, his posture rigid. He had found something. John clenched his jaw, feeling his pulse quicken. He gripped his sidearm and stepped forward, each footstep echoing against the barn's wooden planks. Then he saw it. A shadow darted quickly behind a stack of old hay bales. John froze for half a second, adjusting his stance, his finger tightening on the trigger. His voice cut through the darkness with authority. "Police, if there's anyone in there, come out with your hands where I can see them." The silence that followed was worse than any response he could have received. The only sound was the wind pushing through the gaps in the wooden walls. Maximus let out a low, guttural growl. And then it happened. A gunshot ripped through the night like a sudden clap of thunder. The sound was followed immediately by a sharp, agonizing yelp. John's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes searched frantically for Maximus. His worst nightmare had just come true. John's pulse pounded in his ears as the echo of the gunshot faded into the night. For a split second, his training told him to secure the area, to assess the threat before moving, but his heart overruled his instincts. His eyes locked onto Maximus, who was sprawled on the dirt floor of the barn, his dark fur matted with blood. The dog's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, his whimper barely audible over the racing thoughts in John's head. Without hesitation, John sprinted to his partner, dropping to his knees beside him. His hands trembled as he pressed against Maximus's side, feeling the warmth of the wound beneath his fingertips. The bullet had hit just below the ribs, too close to the lungs, too much blood. His throat tightened. "Stay with me, buddy," he whispered, his voice cracking. Movement. A shadow shifted behind the hay bales. John snapped back to reality, his weapon raised in an instant. His body screamed at him to chase down whoever had fired that shot, to make them pay for what they'd done. But Maximus let out another weak whimper, and that made the decision for him. Revenge could wait. His partner's life couldn't. Gripping Maximus carefully, John hoisted him up onto his shoulders. The weight was heavier than he expected, but he refused to let it slow him down. His legs burned as he pushed forward, his breaths ragged. Every step felt like a mile, and every second was precious. He had parked the cruiser too far. Too damn far. The cold air bit at his face as he staggered through the open field, his boots sinking into the damp earth with every step. He could hear his radio crackling, dispatch calling for an update, but he didn't dare waste a second to respond. He could only focus on one thing, getting Maximus to safety. The flashing red and blue lights of his cruiser came into view, and a surge of adrenaline pushed him forward. He reached the car, yanked open the back door, and carefully placed Maximus inside. Blood smeared across the seat. No time to think. No time to panic. He jumped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and floored it. John didn't care about speed limits, didn't care about protocol. His only concern was the fading rise and fall of Maximus's chest in the rearview mirror. "Hold on, buddy," he muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. The hospital was still miles away, but he wasn't going to let his partner die tonight. Not like this. The tires screeched against the pavement as John pushed the cruiser to its limits, weaving through the empty streets of the quiet town. His hands were clenched so tightly around the steering wheel that his knuckles turned white, but the only thing he could focus on was the faint whimpering from the back seat. Maximus was still breathing, but his breaths were shallow, his body trembling from blood loss. Every few seconds, John glanced at the rearview mirror, watching the dim rise and fall of his partner's chest. "Stay with me, Max. Just hold on, buddy," he muttered, his voice raw with desperation. The police radio crackled to life again, but he ignored it. He had no time to explain, no time to wait for backup. The nearest emergency vet was 15 minutes away under normal conditions. John was determined to make it in less than 10. His heart pounded as he ran a red light, barely missing an oncoming truck whose horn blared angrily into the night. He didn't care. The only thing that mattered was keeping Maximus alive. As he sped down the highway, his mind raced through every possibility. What if he didn't make it in time? What if Maximus slipped away before they reached help? The thought was unbearable. This dog wasn't just his partner, he was family. The only one who had been there through everything. The only one who had saved his life more times than he could count. John swallowed hard, shoving those thoughts away. He couldn't afford to think like that. Not now. Not yet. Up ahead, the neon sign of the emergency vet hospital flickered in the darkness. Relief surged through John, but he knew the fight wasn't over. He pulled into the parking lot so fast that the tires skidded against the pavement. Before the car even came to a full stop, he threw the door open and rushed to the back seat, his hands already reaching for Maximus. The dog's body was limp but still warm, still alive. "Help! I need help!" John's voice echoed through the parking lot as he sprinted toward the entrance, cradling Maximus in his arms. The weight of his partner was nothing compared to the weight of fear pressing down on his chest. Within seconds, the hospital doors burst open, and a team of veterinarians rushed out with a stretcher. A woman in blue scrubs stepped forward, her eyes sharp and professional. "What happened?" she asked, already assessing the wound. "Gunshot wound. Lower ribs. He's lost a lot of blood," John said quickly, his breath ragged. "Get him inside. Now," she ordered, and the team moved fast, placing Maximus onto the stretcher and wheeling him through the hospital doors. John followed close behind, his pulse pounding. This was it. This was the moment that would decide everything. And all he could do now was wait. John paced the cold, sterile waiting room, his hands buried in his pockets, fingers twitching with restless energy. The walls were a pale, lifeless gray, the overhead fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow that made everything feel even more surreal. He had been in high-pressure situations before, gunfights, standoffs, life-or-death moments, but nothing compared to the helplessness he felt now. He had done everything he could. Now, Maximus's life was in the hands of the veterinarians working behind those closed doors. He tried to steady his breathing, but every time he closed his eyes, He saw the moment play out again. The gunshot, the yelp of pain, the way Maximus collapsed. It had all happened so fast, yet it was burned into his mind in agonizing detail. His jaw clenched. He should have been faster. He should have been more careful. Maybe if he had done something differently, his partner wouldn't be fighting for his life right now. A nurse walked by, her sneakers squeaking softly against the tiled floor, but she didn't stop. No update, no reassurance, just silence. John ran a hand through his short, sweat-dampened hair and forced himself to sit down. But the chair felt wrong. Too stiff, too still. He couldn't stay still. Not when every second felt like an eternity. The door to the emergency room finally swung open, and Dr. Evelyn Carter stepped out, pulling off her blood-stained gloves. John was on his feet instantly, his heart pounding so hard it almost drowned out her voice. "He's stable, but it's still critical," she said, her expression carefully neutral. The bullet missed his vital organs by inches, but there was significant blood loss. "We managed to remove it and stop the bleeding, but now we wait." John swallowed hard, his throat dry. "He's going to make it, right?" His voice was steadier than he felt. Dr. Carter hesitated just for a second, just long enough for John's stomach to twist into knots. "He's strong, but the next few hours are crucial." She met his gaze, her eyes softer now. "You got him here just in time." John exhaled sharply, his body sagging with exhaustion, but relief was still out of reach. He nodded, barely able to form words. "Can I see him?" Dr. Carter gave a small nod. "Not yet. Let him rest. But stay close." John didn't need to be told twice. He wasn't going anywhere. John remained standing in the waiting room, his body tense, as if moving from that spot might somehow change the outcome of what was happening behind those closed doors. His uniform was still stained with Maximus's blood, a stark reminder of how close he had come to losing his partner. The metallic scent clung to him, making it impossible to push away the fear gnawing at his chest. He had faced criminals with guns, had run into danger without hesitation countless times. But this was different. This was personal. He tried to sit, but his muscles were too wired, his mind too full of memories flashing in rapid succession. He remembered the first time he met Maximus, a wild, untamed force of nature at the K9 Academy. The trainers had warned him. Maximus was too headstrong, too stubborn to be molded into a perfect police dog. But John had seen something in him, something that reminded him of himself. They had trained together, suffered through grueling drills, and built an unshakable trust. Maximus had been there through everything. And now, all John could do was wait while his best friend fought for his life. The hours crawled by, each minute stretching endlessly. The sterile smell of disinfectant burned his nostrils, mixing with the lingering scent of blood on his clothes. Nurses came and went, whispering in hushed voices, glancing at him with sympathy but offering no updates. John clenched and unclenched his fists, every fiber of his being screaming for action. But he was powerless. He had never felt so useless in his life. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to the emergency unit opened again. Dr. Carter stepped out, her expression unreadable. But John's eyes instantly locked onto the slightest hint of exhaustion in her features. His breath caught in his throat. She wiped her hands on a paper towel before speaking, and every second of silence stretched unbearably. "He's stable," she finally said, her voice calm but firm. "The surgery went well, and he's responding to treatment. He lost a lot of blood, but he's strong. He made it through the worst of it." John's legs nearly gave out beneath him. His entire body sagged with relief, and for the first time since that gunshot rang out, he allowed himself to breathe. He rubbed a hand over his face, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Can I see him now?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but the desperation in it was clear. Dr. Carter nodded. "He's still sedated, but yes, you can see him." She gestured for John to follow, and he didn't waste a second. His boots echoed against the hospital floor as he walked down the hall, his heart hammering against his ribs. When they reached the recovery room, he hesitated for the briefest moment before stepping inside. Maximus lay on a padded bed, and 4 hooked into his leg, bandages wrapped tightly around his side. His breathing was steady but slow, his chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. John exhaled, stepping closer, reaching out to run a gentle hand over the dog's head. "You scared the hell out of me, buddy," he murmured. Maximus didn't respond. He was too deep in sleep, but John felt the warmth of his fur beneath his fingers, felt the quiet assurance that his partner was still there. And for now, that was enough. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the dimly lit recovery room. John sat in the stiff plastic chair beside Maximus's bed, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers laced together. His uniform was still stained with dried blood, but he barely noticed. His entire focus was on the slow, steady rise and fall of Maximus's chest. The worst was over, but the fight wasn't. John had seen it too many times before, survivors who pulled through the worst of an injury, only for complications to set in later. He refused to let himself believe that they were safe just yet. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the edge of the bed, his fingers gently brushing against the soft fur on Maximus's head. The dog didn't stir, but John spoke to him anyway. "You're gonna be okay, partner. You hear me? You don't get to quit on me now." His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it, a mix of exhaustion and determination. "You saved my life more times than I can count. It was my turn to return the favor." Memories surfaced, unbidden. The first time Maximus took down a suspect in a drug bust. The night he barked frantically outside John's apartment until John realized someone was trying to break in. The time he jumped in front of a knife-wielding attacker, taking the hit meant for John. Every moment, every act of loyalty had led to this. They had fought for each other, bled for each other. Maximus wasn't just a K-9 officer, he was John's partner, his family. And John wasn't ready to say goodbye. A soft knock at the door pulled John from his thoughts. He turned to see Captain Reynolds standing there, his expression unreadable, his uniform crisp as always. John straightened slightly, but he didn't leave Maximus's side. "You look like hell, Matthews," Reynolds said, stepping inside. His voice was gruff, but there was something else there, something almost like concern. John let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Yeah, well, it's been one hell of a night." He looked back at Maximus, his jaw tightening. "But he made it." Reynolds nodded, stepping closer. "Damn right he did. You both did." He paused, glancing at the injured dog before meeting John's gaze again. "The department's covering all his medical costs, and when he's ready, his spot on the force is waiting for him." But he hesitated. "If you think he needs to retire after this, the choice is yours." John swallowed hard, looking at Maximus. Retire? The idea of his partner never suiting up again, never riding with him on patrol, felt impossible. But he couldn't think about that now. Not yet. "We'll see," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "First, we focus on getting him back on his feet." Reynolds clapped a hand on John's shoulder before stepping back. "Take all the time you need. You did good tonight, Matthews. Damn good." And with that, he turned and left, leaving John alone with his partner once more. John exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. He wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The first few days after surgery were the hardest. Maximus remained mostly unconscious, his body too weak to move, his breathing slow and measured. John never left his side. He slept in the uncomfortable hospital chair, waking up at every small sound, every slight movement. Nurses came in and out, checking vitals, adjusting medication, offering reassurances, but John couldn't relax. Not until Maximus opened his eyes. Not until he knew for sure that his partner was coming back to him. On the 4th night, something changed. John was half asleep, his head resting against the edge of the bed, when he felt it, a faint, familiar weight against his hand. His eyes snapped open, his breath catching in his throat. Maximus had moved. It wasn't much, just the weak press of his paw against John's fingers, but it was enough to make his chest tighten. "Max," he whispered, sitting up straight. His heart pounded as he watched Maximus's eyelids flutter, his breathing shift, and then, after what felt like an eternity, those dark brown eyes finally opened. For a moment, Maximus seemed disoriented, his gaze unfocused, but then recognition flickered through them. His ears twitched slightly, and he let out the weakest, quietest whimper John had ever heard. But it was there. It was real. John exhaled a shaky breath, a smile breaking through the exhaustion weighing him down. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, running a hand gently over Maximus's head. "You had me worried there." Maximus didn't have the strength to do much, but his tail moved just a fraction, barely a twitch against the bed. It was nothing compared to the strong, excited wag John was used to, but it was enough to send a lump straight to his throat. He swallowed hard, blinking away the sting in his eyes. "Yeah, I know," he whispered. "You're tougher than me. You don't have to rub it in." The door opened, and Dr. Carter stepped inside, stopping short when she saw what was happening. Her expression softened immediately. "Well, would you look at that?" she said, stepping closer. She checked the monitors, listened to Maximus's breathing, and nodded with satisfaction. "This is a very good sign. He's still weak, but if he's waking up, that means he's fighting to recover." John let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That's my boy," he murmured, scratching gently behind Maximus's ear. The dog's eyes fluttered shut again, but this time, it wasn't the heavy unconsciousness of before. This was rest, real rest, healing. And for the first time since that gunshot rang out, John finally allowed himself to believe that everything was going to be okay. He leaned back in his chair, still holding Maximus's paw in his hand. They weren't done fighting yet. There was still a long road ahead, recovery, therapy, maybe even the tough decision about whether Maximus would ever return to duty. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was that his partner was alive, and no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The days following Maximus's awakening were slow, filled with cautious optimism and frustrating setbacks. His body was still weak, his movements sluggish, and even the simplest actions, lifting his head, shifting positions, drinking water, took effort. John remained by his side through it all, refusing to leave, refusing to let his partner fight alone. The hospital staff encouraged him to rest, to go home for a few hours, but he couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the gunshot again, saw Maximus collapsing, felt his own helplessness suffocating him. He wasn't going anywhere. Progress came in small victories. The first time Maximus held his head up for more than a few seconds, John nearly laughed from relief. When he managed to sit up on his own, John clapped his hands and praised him like he had just won a championship. And then, 3 days later, Maximus took his first shaky step. It wasn't graceful. His legs wobbled, his muscles trembled, but John didn't care. "That's it, buddy," he encouraged, crouching in front of him, hands out as if ready to catch him. One step at a time, Maximus let out a huff, his ears twitching in annoyance, and John chuckled. "Yeah, I know. You hate being treated like you're fragile. But humor me, all right?" The physical wounds were healing, but John worried about the invisible scars. Would Maximus ever be the same? Would he still be the fearless, unstoppable K-9 officer he had always been? Or had that bullet taken more than just blood? The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed it away. It was too soon to think about that. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting Maximus strong again. Captain Reynolds visited one evening, standing silently by the door as he watched John help Maximus through a slow walk around the room. When John finally noticed him, he straightened, wiping the exhaustion from his face. "He's coming along," he said, gesturing toward the dog. Reynolds nodded, arms crossed. "Yeah, and so are you." John frowned, but the captain didn't elaborate. Instead, he stepped forward and crouched slightly, reaching out a hand. Maximus sniffed it, then gave a slow, approving lick. Reynolds smirked. "Guess he still likes me." John let out a tired chuckle. Barely, but there was something in Reynolds's expression, something unsaid. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was respect. Maybe it was the understanding of what it meant to almost lose a partner. The older man stood, exhaling through his nose. "You need time, Matthews. Both of you. Don't rush it." John nodded, though he wasn't sure what time meant. How long did it take to heal from something like this? A week? A month? Would they ever truly be the same? He didn't have the answer, but as he looked at Maximus, his partner, his best friend, his reason for pushing forward, he knew one thing for sure. No matter what came next, they'd figure it out. Together. That night, for the first time since the shooting, John fell asleep in the hospital chair without nightmares. And beside him, Maximus slept soundly, his body still weak but his spirit unbroken. 2 weeks had passed since the night that nearly took Maximus's life. The sterile walls of the veterinary hospital had become a second home, but John knew they couldn't stay there forever. Maximus was stronger now, eating on his own, walking short distances, even wagging his tail with more energy. But there was still hesitation in his steps, a cautiousness that had never been there before. He was different. They both were. The day Maximus was cleared to leave, John felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. Dr. Carter gave her final instructions: restricted movement, no sudden exertion, continued monitoring, but John barely processed the words. He was too focused on Maximus, who stood beside him, his posture steady but his eyes tired. As they walked out of the hospital together, John placed a hand on his partner's head. "Let's go home, buddy." Maximus leaned into the touch. It wasn't the eager, bounding excitement John was used to, but it was something. Back at John's small house, everything felt familiar yet unfamiliar at the same time. Maximus hesitated at the doorway, sniffing cautiously before stepping inside. John watched him closely, his heart clenching. Would he ever fully recover? Would he still have the same fire, the same fearlessness that made him one of the best K-9 officers in the force? Or had that night changed him forever? The first real test came the next morning. John took Maximus outside, watching as he stretched and adjusted to the open space. Then, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn-out tennis ball. Maximus's favorite. He held it up, giving a small smirk. "What do you say, partner? Think you still got it?" For a long moment, Maximus just stared at the ball. He didn't bark, didn't tense with anticipation like he used to. Instead, he simply stood there, watching. John's chest tightened. Maybe it was too soon. Maybe. Then suddenly Maximus moved. It wasn't the powerful sprint John remembered, but it was something. His paws pressed into the dirt, his body shifting into motion. He trotted forward, then faster until he snatched the ball up in his jaws. When he turned back to John, tail wagging, something flickered in his eyes. A spark. A piece of the old Maximus, still in there, still fighting. John let out a slow breath, walking up to him, running a hand through his fur. "That's my boy," he murmured. Maximus let out a huff and nudged the ball against John's leg, silently asking for another throw. And just like that, something in John's chest loosened. They weren't the same as before, but maybe they didn't have to be. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. That night, as Maximus lay beside John's chair, sleeping peacefully, John finally let himself believe it. They were going to be okay. It wouldn't be easy. There were still questions unanswered, challenges ahead. But one thing was certain: whatever came next, they'd face it together. A month had passed since the night that nearly took everything from them. The scars on Maximus's body had begun to fade, but John knew the real battle had never been physical. It was in the hesitation, the uncertainty in Maximus's eyes every time they stepped outside. It was in the way he watched the patrol car instead of leaping inside like he used to. John had told the department he needed time before deciding if Maximus would return to duty. The truth was, he wasn't sure if his partner still wanted to. One morning, John took Maximus to the station, not as an officer but just to visit. The moment they walked through the doors, the entire unit turned to look. Officers who had worked beside them, who had feared the worst that night, now stood in quiet respect. A few claps started, then more, until the entire room was applauding. Maximus's ears perked up slightly at the sound, his tail giving a slow, tentative wag. Captain Reynolds stepped forward, arms crossed but eyes softer than usual. "Good to see you both back on your feet," he said. Then, looking down at Maximus, he smirked. "Think you still got what it takes, boy?" John held his breath, watching as Maximus stared up at Reynolds, then at the training area beyond. The old Maximus wouldn't have needed a second to decide. But after a few long moments, something shifted. Maximus straightened his posture, his ears alert. His tail wagged again, this time with confidence. Then, without warning, he moved. He trotted toward the obstacle course, past the officers watching in silence. John felt his chest tighten as he followed, heart pounding. The course was the same one Maximus had run 100 times before, but this time it was different. This time it meant everything. John stood at the starting line. Maximus turned to him, waiting. John's throat tightened. "All right, partner," he said, voice low but steady. "Let's do this." The moment the command left John's lips, Maximus surged forward. He jumped over the hurdles, his muscles moving with a power John hadn't seen in weeks. He weaved through the cones, leapt through the tunnel, and sprinted to the finish line. By the time he stopped, panting but standing tall, John knew the answer. Maximus hadn't lost who he was. He had just needed time to find his way back. John walked up to him, kneeling down, placing a hand over his back. "Yeah," he murmured. "You're ready." And just like that, the unit's best K9 officer was back where he belonged.